Good morning, everybody. Great to see so many of you, and welcome to the Coinbase Crypto Forum. I am totally delighted to be joined by two such distinguished guests for this panel this morning. So we have Nick Clegg, who is the former Deputy Prime Minister of the UK, as you all know, former leader of the Liberal Democrats, and he was also former head of global affairs at Meta. He's also just recently become an author. So holding it up, how to save the internet in this very technicolor dust jacket. I think available at all good bookshops.
Oh yes,
there you go.
At a decent price. Yeah.
And George Osborne, of course, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, former editor of the Evening Standard, senior managing director at Evercore, and a member of the Coinbase Global Advisory Committee. So we're delighted to have you both here. We thought that we wanted to have a framing conversation, as OC just said, about some big topics, about the future of the internet, about the future of money, about the future of AI, and maybe a little bit about the future of politics as well. Now, we like doing firsts at Coinbase. We like doing things a bit differently. So this is, I think, and both George and Nick, you have to tell me if I get this wrong, the first time that they've been together since they were partners, but political rivals in coalition government from 2010 to 2015. So this is the first time. I was going to offer to sit between them.
I might move up.
I was going to offer.
Nice to be back.
Yes. Well, we haven't actually seen each other.
But in public.
Right.
The first time we've been seen in public as a couple since the coalition.
It's a coming out moment.
So this is an important moment that you're all witnessing here, and we thought it would be a bit of fun at the end, rather than take audience Q&A, but to actually ask Nick and ask George whether they wanted to ask each other a question, given that this is the bromance is back together, as it were. So excited for that, and we'll leave some time at the end. Let me dive straight into it. Nick, I'm going to kick off with you, if that's okay. Reading your book, you talk about the balkanization, potentially, of the internet moving forward in the future. So going from this kind of global digital commons that everybody was sharing, and that's now splitting up into different kind of regions. I think you refer to it as the splinternet. The question for you is that really happening at what speed? Is there a way of preventing that? And why must we prevent that? So it would be great to get your thoughts.
Yes, I think it is happening at pace, but in a somewhat imperceptible way. It's a sort of classic sort of boiling frog thing that will only sort of regret losing the seamlessness of the non-Chinese global internet when we no longer have it. And I think there is a risk that we might look back in 10 years' time and say, do you remember that time when we could, without any friction, effortlessly send content of any, in its various forms, effortlessly from one hemisphere to the next? There are a whole bunch of reasons why the splinternet is fragmenting and balkanizing in the way that it is. It's partly political, this big clash between the globalization of technology, of which generative AI, of course, is the latest manifestation, the sort of elimination of geography by technology, but the deglobalization of politics everywhere. And maybe the latter is a reaction to the former, but everywhere, whether it's Brexit, Erdogan, Modi, Trump, it's all about building barriers and sort of retrenching and the sort of us and them politics. And that then manifests itself in countless different ways, from incursions on open data flows, to content standards, to erratic regulation. And then, of course, overshadowing all of that is this great standoff between China and the United States, the two preeminent technological powers. And I predict, and I explain in the book, that I think China will pull more and more countries into its sort of paradigmatic approach to hiving itself off from the rest of the internet and then heavily surveilling the internet within its own borders. And I think that is becoming increasingly attractive, whether you are in Turkey, Russia, Vietnam, the authorities there, autocratic, semi-autocratic authorities, are all trying to assert sovereignty over something which generally escapes sovereignty. So I think it is happening. I think it is the reason I wrote the book, because I don't think it is attracting nearly as much attention as it should. And it requires, and that is, of course, wholly absent at the moment, an active, active will, political will, by the three major techno-democracies in the world, the US, India, and Europe in sort of descending order of importance to create new guardrails and swim lanes in which the AI-powered internet can continue to be open. So anyway, there you go. You don't need to read the book because I've just basically given you the summary. But that in a nutshell is, I mean, the internet is an interesting thing because it almost emerged by accident. There was no blueprint, there was no design, but I think it needs an act of political will for it to be, for the openness of it at least, to be safeguarded for future generations.
Fantastic. You don't actually mention crypto in the book, but obviously we've got a kind of blockchain, digital assets, crypto audience here. But some of the ethos that's really important to us in this room is about kind of lack of censorship and ability to kind of transfer peer-to-peer, that kind of openness, et cetera, which seems to overlap a lot with the manifesto, or at least the ethos under your manifesto for how to save the internet from that balkanization. I wondered if there is a role for kind of digital assets and for kind of Web3 and decentralization within your vision of the future internet.
Hugely. See, the interesting thing about generative AI, amongst other things, is that it's, I call it in the book, the sort of power paradox of these technologies. On the one hand, so much technological innovation from these great hyperscalers empowers all of us. Every single one of us in this room are empowered through the little things we carry in our pockets and the little screens that we spend all our time swiping and looking at all day to do a versatility of things which is almost without precedent in human history. At the same time, it aggregates and concentrates an extraordinary amount of power in the hands of a very small number of men on the west coast of the United States, and of course, increasingly the tech leaders in China as well. And generative AI is only going to exacerbate that because the physics of generative AI, at least the LLM paradigm that we're in at the moment, is incredibly centralizing because it's just so expensive to get hold of all the GPUs, build the data centers, the energy, the data, and so on and so forth. And so I think that does, well, I think over time that will evolve. I personally have some doubts whether the LLM paradigm itself can deliver all the the holy grail of AI that many of its proponents suggest. But it also, I think, will lead to is leading to a real backlash against so much over-concentration of power in such small hands. And I do think blockchain technologies, decentralized Web3 technologies, can play an incredibly powerful role in a whole host of different ways to counterbalance that. Now, how they interact, of course, will be fascinating to watch in the next few years. And you guys at Coinbase and others are right at the there's always going to be someone who's going to say you're not. I mean, I know you get criticism from the crypto purists that Coinbase is not decentralized enough. There's always going to be someone who will out-centralize or out-decentralize you. But the fundamental decentralization, centralization thing is a huge shaper of the world we're going to inhabit. Yeah, for sure.
Totally agree. And we may come back to AI a bit later on. But if I may, I just may pivot to George for a second. George, lots of people in this room no doubt saw an op-ed that you wrote recently in the FT, where you talked particularly about the UK and what the UK is doing in kind of crypto. And I think you expressed some concerns there about the speed of the UK's regulation in this space.
First of all, it's great to be here. And congratulations to the people who've put the conference on. So, 10 years ago, when I was the Chancellor, on camera, at Canary Wharf, used a Bitcoin ATM. Now, unfortunately, the rules at the time meant that I had to return the Bitcoin that I'd taken out of the ATM rather than keep it, but it would have been much better to have kept it. But what I wanted to do at the time, and Nick was obviously a key member of this government, we wanted to embrace innovation. We wanted to say Britain is the home of financial innovation. We are right here in the center of the City of London, and we've always been the place where new markets emerge, and Britain is at the center of that kind of global financial network. And I feel in the 10 years since, Britain has missed the boat on crypto, and other jurisdictions have kind of taken a lead, for example, in the Middle East or in Asia. And I think there was a kind of laziness that said, well, the US is so hostile that we can just be a little bit less hostile. And I heard, and this is not a partisan point, because this was true of the previous kind of successor governments to the ones we were in, the various conservative prime ministers. They kept saying, we're going to do lots of things for crypto. And then this Labour government came in and said, we're going to be all for innovation. And like nothing happened. So that, until very, very recently, the last few days, retail customers can't get a Bitcoin ETF, even though in the United States they could. There's legislation was promised time and again, I know, to Coinbase and others on, stable coins and staking, and it didn't happen. And then, of course, you got this dramatic change in the United States with the arrival of the Trump administration. Major legislation, it should be said bipartisan. People keep talking about, the partisan nature of US politics. But in fact, the Genius Act was an incredible bipartisan effort in the Senate and the House and so on. And now the UK is sitting in, by the way, you could say the same with some other European jurisdictions, way behind the US. And that is not the right place for us to be. And, you say I wrote an op-ed for the FT. I did, and it's not that I write these, I can't remember the last time I wrote an op-ed on anything. So it's not like I'm endlessly sort of writing in newspapers. But I felt so strongly that we were missing this opportunity that I said that. And, it's interesting because, I'm certainly not the only person who pointed this out. But literally in the last few weeks, you've begun to hear from the Chancellor of the Exchequer, from the Governor of the Bank of England, from the PRA and the FCA in particular, a kind of more ambitious approach. And I think that's a good thing. And, one kind of potentially positive straw in the wind was coming out of the recent Trump state visit here was a commitment that the UK Treasury and the US Treasury were going to work together on future markets, I think is what they called it, but they're talking about what we're talking about today, crypto. And, I think that's a big opportunity for the UK to kind of hitch more of its bandwagon to what's going on in the US. I wish it had been the other way around, but it hasn't been. But now we need to get our act together.
Fantastic. Certainly a big opportunity for the UK, that task force. George, you mentioned stable coins, which I think is a good opportunity to bring you back in, Nick. So a lot of us have read the history of, I think, Facebook, as it was back then, and the DM project, or the Libra project.
Yeah.
It seemed to kind of change its names from time to time. Really ahead of its time, if we think about where we are now. I just would like to invite you to reflect on that. Was it the design of the project? Was it the timing? Was it the politics? Or was it a mixture of things that ultimately led Facebook to shelve that?
No, it wasn't the design. It was because it was linked to Facebook. I mean, honestly, I think the Libra project would have had takeoff if it wasn't umbilically linked to Facebook as it was then. But partly for, I guess, design reasons, because that just gives you such an umbilical relationship with 4 billion consumers overnight. And the shopfront window is just so vast at such scale, and that, of course, makes the regulators super nervous. But just because of the politics and the timing, as George has just explained, there's been this huge sea change. And remember, Trump 1 was really quite antagonistic to a lot of non-traditional, financial innovation. That it was another time, and the Democrat administration at the time, the Biden administration at the time, at least the regulators were pretty antagonistic towards Silicon Valley generally and towards big tech. Of course, Facebook, Meta, is a company which is never more than a heartbeat away from controversy because it's dealing in human speech and of course have been through this hugely controversial cycle from 2016, Russian interference in the elections then, Cambridge Analytica and so on. And so if you're Janet Yellen or if you're the Democrat head of the finance committee in the Senate, it's just an easy target. So I don't think it was the design. I think the design was actually really smart. I think David Marcus and others did some really, really great and innovative work in that field. I just think it was the wrong time. It was too early and associated with the wrong company in terms of the sort of acceptability of the idea to regulators.
George, on that, I mean, you were still in politics at that time. Do you remember that episode as well?
Yeah, I mean, I actually got a few conversations with Dave Marcus and with Mark Zuckerberg about Libra. And I think that kind of, in some ways, you know, and I'm sort of observing from the outside, you know, a lot of these big tech companies had until that point kind of done things and then sought permission afterwards.
That's right.
So they kind of created the internet, or they created social media, and then like governments were thrown this question of, well, how do we regulate this, or do we regulate it, whatever. In the case of Libra, there was a sort of specific issue, which was, I think, Facebook announced its ambition before it actually had the product ready. And it was back in the days when I think crypto was very libertarian and anti-government. And I think, I'm right in recollecting, that essentially Facebook said, we're going to replace the dollar. And then everyone who cares about the dollar, i.e. the US government and US, you know, the Federal Reserve and Congress and whatever, said, I don't think you are, actually. And I think what happened from memory is they said, well, if you want to be a bank, we'll regulate you like a bank. And that's the other thing, you know, I think in social media and the early stages, or the first few decades of the internet, in some ways, these were unregulated spaces because people didn't even know you could have social media. When you get into finance, or indeed healthcare, these are heavily regulated spaces already. And so it's a different, I think it's a different game. And I think, you know, Coinbase as a company, I think understood this in a way that other players, big players in this space, didn't. That you have to, you know, and I think your approach has always been engage with government, talk to government, get government and legislators to understand what we're doing. We're not anti-government. We see a role for government and so on. I think that's been a much smarter approach. And I think for this industry, it's also been on quite a journey from this, you know, I mean, of course, the actual original creation of Bitcoin was without government. And that was part of the vision. And there's still absolutely, I'm sure there are people in this room who are still part of that movement. But the truth is, if you look at all the interest in stablecoins, you know, that is actually a return to fiat money and connection with the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve and da-da-da. And maybe it is, I hadn't really thought about this still, but joining the dots is a bit of what Nick was talking about as well. It's the kind of reassertion of politics and government in our world. Yeah. And financial regulators are saying, look, if we're talking about money, like, we're going to have a seat at the table.
Well, by the way, just to sort of amplify George's point, you're quite right. I remember saying to Mark Zuckerberg and David Marcus at the time, say, look, from a politician's point of view, you're talking about money. I mean, they don't make all these distinctions. What are you going to do next? Say you're going to run a weather service or run an army? It's kind of like the political response is always going to recoil, and I think it's changed enormously since then. But I think you're quite right. Then it was still the Silicon Valley thing of we ship our products and then the world will, you know, kind of adapt around it or respond in one way or the other. So, yeah.
Well, maybe just to kind of unpack that a little bit more, like how do we get that balance right between ensuring that Silicon Valley, and let's hope in the UK as well, you know, there is that innovation and like products get shipped, but we are in this heavily regulated financial services environment where you've got to protect consumers, you've got to protect the people who are the most vulnerable. But if we go for like a zero failure regime, then kind of nothing happens and people don't invest in how do you scale it. And it's the same in tech and it's a bit the same in financial services. So yeah, just interested in your thoughts on how to strike that balance and whether in the UK right now we do have that right balance.
Well, I think generally, I mean, this is an observation of the current Chancellor, so I don't think it's controversial. But you know, I think we've allowed in all sorts of areas regulators to become too disconnected from what the elected government is trying to achieve. And you find this in all sorts of things like planning and, you know, and other walks of life. I think, you know, the way I'd start is, like, you know, there are legitimate concerns of government. And government, by the way, is an expression of the public. The public have legitimate things to be concerned about. They are concerned about financial stability. So when markets crash and banks fail, everyone in this room has to pay up. And it's incredible. You could argue we're all still living in the shadow of the financial crash in 2008. So there's a financial stability concern. There's a consumer protection concern. We have long, you know, we have long said you can't just sell poison to people. You can't sell Ponzi schemes to people. You can't, you know, we have regulations of medicine and we have regulations of financial products. So there's consumer protection. And then finally, there are legitimate concerns about money laundering and crime, stopping crime. We have police forces. And I think, if you engage with those things and say, how can we help government or the society, improve financial stability, find appropriate ways to protect consumers, help law enforcement agencies stop, terrorists financing themselves, for example. If you lean into that and find solutions, that's the right attitude for companies. And I think for the regulators themselves, however, you've got to shift. At the moment, if you're running one of these big regulators, there is absolutely zero incentive on you personally and your management to allow for innovation and because you're not really being judged against kind of growth of financial services or growth of the economy. You're being judged like, did you let this company fail and all these poor people lose their money, right? If you look at the head of the FCA, that's what he gets interrogated about by Parliament. So I think you have to change the mandate, the requirement on these regulators and what they're going to be assessed against, so that the FCA also is being judged against, is it creating an environment for innovation and cost reduction and opportunity for UK consumers, if you're talking specifically about the UK. And it's not enough just to get the regulators into the room and kind of give them a talking to, which is what a succession of, there have been like 7 chancellors since me, so it's a bit of a devalued currency. But, they always got, every year one comes along and says, get the regulators in the room and tell them that's not enough. Government sets the framework, and government should tell these regulators they will be judged, yes, on some of the things like consumer protection responsibilities, but they have to balance them, make difficult judgments around also opportunity, democratization of financial products, reducing costs of financial products, and so on. And that requires changing their mandate.
Thank you. Nick, that kind of leads us on, I think, to the other big topic that is getting regulated slowly, which is AI. You've had a ringside seat, I think, in the development of some of the biggest kind of models there at your time of Facebook. I'm interested in your kind of sense of kind of speed of adoption, what's happening, what's coming next, and then maybe taking you back a bit around what role can kind of blockchains potentially play in there around deep fakes and trust, which I think is one of the central kind of concerns that we have with AI.
Yeah, look, firstly, no one knows. The amount of hype and nonsense talked about AI is just extraordinary. I learned after, almost 7 years in Silicon Valley, there's 2 groups of people you should not listen to at all. It's the most ardent proponents of technology and the most ardent opponents of technology, because they often wildly exaggerate technology, either for good or for bad. And the interaction between new technology and human behavior is often way more complex than the technologists themselves understand. So Silicon Valley has this rather irritating hubristic tendency of thinking if they've invented something on Tuesday, everybody should be using it by Thursday. In fact, if you look at technological adoption, the time lag tends to be way more complex. Look at desktop computing. Desktop computing was technologically available pretty well 20 years before it actually became completely prevalent in every workplace across the developed society. So my gut, the tendency, of course, is to listen to these technologists who are particularly those who've got the capabilities to train these very powerful foundation models, Anthropic, OpenAI, Meta, Amazon, Google, and so on, as if they're also labor market specialists or sociologists or philosopher kings. They're not. They're great technologists, but they don't know anything about labor markets. They don't listen to those people about some of the breathless things they say about how many people are going to be thrown out of employment or whether it's going to affect the blue collar or white collar. They don't know is actually the truth. My hunch, honestly, I wouldn't hold any greater store in it than anybody else's, is that adoption will obviously be very fast in some obvious sectors where the application is just such an obvious low-hanging fruit to improve productivity and so on. But that at a societal level, I think deployment and adoption is going to be slower than people think. There is some evidence, some quite interesting research recently from MIT and Princeton, which suggests that that is the case, that in fact it's a lot harder, particularly in corporate structures where you've got CEOs who know nothing about AI, many of them don't actually use it very much, and just sort of they send out a command saying, thou shalt use AI in the workplace, and then lots of underlings try and do it, and it doesn't quite fit, and the data is not, because remember, to use these AI systems well, you've got to have clean data, usable data. That's often quite tricky. So I think that retrofitting of everybody's data practices and so on, just at a societal level, it doesn't mean that there isn't going to be a very quick effect on health diagnostics or advertising, or some very obvious areas where the effect is moving apace. But I think at a societal level, it'll be somewhat slower than that. And do you know what? That may not be a bad thing, because history suggests that, firstly, we as a species have been through enormous labor displacement, technological changes. I mean, just think about the mechanization of agriculture, displacing basically the whole of society, living off the land and no longer doing so. Obviously, the Industrial Revolution and so on. And I write about this a bit in my book. If you look at the history of technological, the adoption of technologies, it's the pace of it that is often can lead to greater ructions, division, even violence, than the adoption of it itself. And I actually think the adoption will be a little slower than many people are breathlessly predicting, and that may not be a bad thing. But again, who knows?
I was smiling when you said that, because at Coinbase, our CEO did tell us to use the AI as much as possible.
But he knows something about it, which is a difference to some.
But I think he was right to do that, and I think we are all using it very much. But the societal versus the...
You just wanted to get that on the record.
He's watching.
George, any reaction to that, or I'll move you on to...
No, I think there's a lot of sense in what Nick says, although... I think when the adoption, it may be delayed, but it can then happen very quickly. And, I think with driverless cars, I first went in a driverless car on the kind of road between San Francisco and Silicon Valley as Chancellor of the Exchequer in about 2013. So that's, 12 years ago. And then everyone goes, well, what happened to the driverless cars? Well, many of you will go to San Francisco, and you will know now you can get driverless taxis, and I used one on my most recent visit. I teach at Stanford, so I'm there quite regularly. And it's a really good service, and I'm not sure why you would not want to use a driverless car in San Francisco at the moment. And, so I think once the kind of, it's taken much longer to deploy than people would have said back in 2013, but when it comes, it will be quick. And I guess the question then of where does kind of crypto fit and all that, and blockchain, I think there's an interesting angle on it, which is obviously one of the kind of big challenges, and we were both in politics and didn't have to face this, is kind of fake news, real fake news. Not just a politician getting up and saying something that's not true, but literally a fake video or which can be very, people will start to notice already if you're on, social media, quite striking kind of videos that then kind of disclaimers are put up, but, often hours after they've already circulated. And blockchain is a kind of tool for authentication, potentially, which is quite interesting how that will, you could potentially use the blockchain technology to combat fake news.
Yeah, and I think it was Mark Andreessen who was talking about this over the summer, and I think he's right, because I remember when I was at Meta, all the pressure from the regulators and the politicians and the press when this uptick in synthetic media started appearing online was, and I remember myself and my counterparts from Brad Smith from Microsoft, Kent Walker from Google, we all got together at, I think it was the Munich Security Conference about 3 years ago, and signed something that we were going to create an industrial forum on the labeling and watermarking of synthetic content. But the engineers certainly told me privately, and they were right, they've been proved right, saying, you do realize in the long run that is not a sustainable strategy. In the long run, trying to play whack-a-mole with synthetic content is simply not going to work at the sheer volume at which synthetic content is going to become ever more prevalent, or hybrid content. And of course, a huge amount of synthetic content is entirely innocuous. A change in the color and the background of an ad. Do you have to watermark that? Do you have to kite mark that? So I think doing exactly the reverse, as George suggests, and trying to use cryptographic ways of, on blockchain, of actually verifying non-synthetic content may actually be the way to go in future, for sure.
No, it makes a lot of sense. Someone smarter than me once said that AI is going to scale content and blockchain will scale trust.
Right.
So how it does that, along the lines that you described, will be very interesting to see. I'm going to jump us ahead because you've both been in politics, but also been in the private sector. I'm interested in the way you would tell the story and the kind of the storytelling of crypto and the narrative of kind of digital assets. And obviously, kind of Nick, you're a kind of master of kind of the tech side of this. What is it that we've been getting wrong? If we think that this technology could and should lead to a transformation in payments, a transformation in capital markets through tokenization, which we'll talk about later, how do we get people to take it more seriously, policymakers in particular? Is there something that you think we as an industry are not saying that we should say more, turn up the volume? Interested in your views.
So, look, I'm not as close to it as you are in terms of the industry, but first, from what I little understand, I think you're right, as George explained, for Coinbase to not rail against regulation, but engage with it. You have to do it. Look, it's not about the private sector versus regulators. It's always a three-part thing. It's private sector, innovators, regulators, and the public. And what will drive so much of this will be greater and greater public adoption. So, of course, the more that you make your technology usable and user-friendly for the non-specialist, the non-early adopter. I mean, it's when our parents and our grandparents start using these technologies that really it will become ever more prevalent. You're still at the early, relatively early stage of this curve, and I think doing that as much as you can, hand in glove with regulators, is a smart thing. My own hunch is this issue. I know there's lots of, the banks go around saying, oh, crypto is a gift for fraudsters and scammers and crime and so on. And then the industry says, no, that's not true. Look, it's actually cash-based crime, which is worse. And there's a lot of crime, of course, which happens through the traditional financial system. But I think winning that argument seems to me to be absolute sine qua non for you, not Coinbase, but as the industry, in order to enhance trust. I think there's only one other thing I would mention, which I've George is going to be horrified perhaps, but I've become more sort of French in my thinking about technological...
Well, even more.
Yeah, even more. I think the rupture in the sort of across the Atlantic in the sort of Trump 2 administration is not a temporary thing. I think it's a very real, big turning of the page. I think it's the end of the Cold War settlement. I think it's the end of the sort of Cold War special relationship as we have tended to over-rely on in this country. So I think the sort of sovereignty issue of control and agency for technologies which are being pioneered in the United States is going to become a bigger and bigger, of course it already is in countries like France, which have always been a bit chippy and sensitive about this. I think that is going to become a bigger and bigger thing for younger generations, for what I'd call the post-Cold War generation. And one enormous frustration I have coming back from Silicon Valley to here is the way in which the British political and media establishment seem to be so slow in understanding how profoundly the transatlantic relationship has changed. And it's like those cartoon characters who are off the edge of a cliff and still keep running. They're still just sort of pretending as if nothing has changed. It's changed utterly, and I think that will have ramifications over time for your industry as well.
George, any thoughts on the storytelling piece?
Well, I think I don't wholly agree with Nick about the transatlantic relationship. I think what's really fracturing it is not just like Trump. It's the growth of the US economy and the fact that the European economies, including the UK, are not keeping up. When we were in government, I used to always think, okay, so the United States is obviously much bigger and it's a bit more capitalist and it's probably going to have a slightly higher growth rate. But we're in touching distance. And there will be lots of reasons why you want to be based in London or in New York, for example, in financial services. I do feel in the last few years quite a kind of gap has opened up. Oh, yeah. Not just here, but even more so with some of the continental economies. And that ultimately is what will undermine this relationship. You know, ultimately, if the United States, you know, sees no utility in having its European partners, that they can't really contribute to defense, that they can't really, you know, contribute to the innovation and productivity of the Western capitalist economy. So that's the kind of challenge to European policymakers on this side of the Atlantic. And these, you know, and it's doable. I mean, I know, to take a slightly odd case, look at Italy. I mean, Italy was like 10 years ago, no one paid any attention to the Italian economy, and there a series of decisions in recent years has, you know, put Italy or Greece. You know, when I was finance minister, we had like endless meetings on Greece and the basket case, and you know, IMF coming in and the European, the Eurozone coming in and so on. And now actually the Greek economy has been one of the best performing economies in recent years because of some decisions. And so you can actually do things with, you know, I guess I wouldn't have been in politics if I didn't think there's agency for governments to improve things. On the kind of specifically on crypto, the crypto narrative, I guess I think there's kind of central challenge for the industry is there, I think you've established that these are real assets that people want to invest in. And that's legitimate for people to hold in their portfolios, Bitcoin and, you know, and other assets. I think trying to prove use cases beyond kind of trading and just investment is the kind of big next challenge. And I think it exists. You know, I think the whole debate around tokenization and, you know, if you can tokenize real estate and and equities and commodities, you know, all sorts of things might start to happen, which are really interesting. So I think it's sort of proving other use cases, which ultimately is what then governments will get more interested in, because fundamentally governments aren't that interested in just sort of day-to-day trading and portfolio construction.
I agree, and I think the rest of the day we'll unpack some of those themes. So the clock is ticking down. This is the fun bit for me. So I get to kind of stop being moderator.
You're not enjoying it?
I'm having a great time. But I'm now going to give you both a chance to set the record straight, as it were. So George, why don't we start with you?
Well, we did actually confer beforehand, so we've decided to ask each other the same question.
Okay.
I don't know who wants to go first. You're probably going to think it's quite a boring question. I'm looking at this audience. I was going to ask Nick what he thought was, you know, we were in government for 5 years together. What was in the coalition government, what was the greatest success and the greatest failure of that government?
Yeah, so for those of you interested in that sort of period of political history, 2010 to 15, my answer would be the biggest failure. I think we've failed, like so many governments have, of all persuasions, on housing. I wish, with hindsight, if I'd done it again, and there are lots of other things which we can talk about, but actually I think the singular failure for government after government after government to do big things, to really shift the dial on building far, far, far more housing. And I remember we would often have quite a tug of war of this, because quite understandably, the Conservatives were slightly more market-oriented and wanted to get a whole bunch of incentives into the system to, you can describe better than I can, but anyway, to sort of incentivize getting people to get into the market. In the first place, I kind of felt that was just going to add to a bunch of distortions in the market. I wanted a slightly more state-centered approach to actually just building, to just using the brute force of the state. So it wasn't actually an area of very productive coalition politics on housing. But I don't think we can be entirely blamed for that, because no government's actually really gripped housing. But it's just such a terrible Achilles heel in this country, the lack of affordable housing. So that's the biggest failure. Look, biggest success, I mean, where do I start? I think by I think by a long chalk, that coalition government was the most successful government this country's had for the last decade and a half plus. If you look at the circumstances in which we came in the wake of this sort of near-death experience of the 2008 financial crash, which hit us way harder than almost any other G7 economy because of the oversized nature of our financial services sector compared to the rest of the economy. And then by 2012, 13, the last 2 or 3 years of the coalition, I keep reading and keep hearing it from the government and from the commentariat that there has been no growth in this country since 2010. It's just not true. We actually were the fastest growing economy consistently, quarter after quarter after quarter, for the latter part of the coalition. then it all, unfortunately, just blew up with the madness of Brexit, which is a separate thing. But I think to go from the rubble of 2008, steady the ship, when, by the way, politically steadying the ship as well, because governments were falling like 9 pins, is it 9 pins or 10 pins? 9 pins, across Europe at the time, and then introduce a whole bunch of reforms in pensions, education, apprenticeships, energy, and so on, and then come out towards the second half of that coalition government with the fastest growing economy in the developed world. I think it's an extraordinary economic and political feat. So no, I think there's a huge amount, but the housing thing would be the thing I would mark us down on most.
So
what about you?
Yeah, I think on the sort of policy front, I think the biggest failure was health reform. Because I think we did do, on the successes, education, there's been a massive improvement in school standards in England as a result of the education reforms from that period. The clean energy revolution started then, the economic record, and so on. Healthcare, we misfired, and no one's touched it since, including this Labour government. And the NHS is becoming, therefore, has not had any reform for a long period, and is as a result a big challenge. So on the policy front, there are successes like education, the economy, and so on. But I think actually it's the politics. So I think the biggest success was this. If you think of all that's happened since in Britain, the 6 chancellors, I can't even remember, 5 prime ministers. I think a lot of optimism when there was a Labour government elected a year ago with a big majority that things would be stable and strong again, and that hasn't been the case. This was a functional government of 2 different political parties working, in an unpartisan way, and it felt like Britain had a plan. You might not have liked all of it, and certainly there were bits people didn't like, but fundamentally there was a plan, and we have not seen that since. And then the biggest failure was not to endure. And I think there's I'm slightly, put this in a slightly sort of cheeky way to both Nick and, in fact, to David Cameron, which is we should have run for re-election as a coalition. We should have said, job's not done yet, give us another 5 years. And that would have been very difficult. I was not the party leader. Nick was a party leader. David was a party leader. And they would have had to get, like, Liberal Democrats not to stand in Conservative seats and Conservatives not to stand in Liberal Democrat seats. Very tricky, much easier said than done. But fundamentally, you could have run as a coalition and entrenched that style of politics. Instead, in fact, what happened in the Conservative end, which I was, in the room for, we went after the Liberal Democrat seats.
With some success, unfortunately.
Nick lost his seat, for example. But what did that mean for George Osborne and David Cameron? Well, like a year later, we were turfed out. It was not, and a very different style of politics emerged in our country. Much more partisan, much more confrontational, actually much less productive. And not much was achieved in the years afterwards. And so that, to my mind, is the failure, that we weren't able to make it last.
That feels like a really good point to draw this to a close. It is amazing to have you both back together. Thank you so much for doing it. Please, everyone, join me in a round of applause for George Osborne and Nick.
Thank you very much.